How could the fury of 800 Vikings destroy an army of 40,000 Saracens? The question conjures up a legendary image: bloodthirsty Danish axes, guttural war cries echoing in the Andalusian sun, and a handful of northern heroes crushing an uncounted horde. It's the kind of story forged in the sagas, an epic tale of David versus Goliath, where valor and ferocity overcome any numerical disadvantage. We imagine longships gliding stealthily down a strange river, their crews disembarking, like wolves among sheep, ready to etch their names into history with fire and steel. This is the legend that has traveled through the centuries, a tale of a raid so audacious, so brutal, that it seems almost superhuman in its success. But that story is a lie. The truth, documented in the chronicles of the time, is far more terrible and revealing, and paints a diametrically opposite picture. The annihilation was not of the Saracen army, but of the Viking invaders themselves. It was not a Norse victory, but a systematic massacre that served as a brutal lesson in humility. The real question is not how the Vikings won. It is how one of the world's most feared plundering forces was lured, surrounded, and exterminated with such methodical and ruthless efficiency. This is not a saga of improbable triumph, but the chronicle of a disaster, a story of hubris punished by the sophisticated war machine of an underestimated empire. What could have gone so catastrophically wrong for the masters of terror and plunder? How could veteran warriors hardened on the coasts of France and England become such easy prey? The answer lies hidden in the very nature of their initial success. Their audacity turned into overconfidence, their surprise attack tactics into a death trap. They failed to reckon with the fact that their enemy was not a fragmented, slow-to-respond kingdom like the ones they knew, but a centralized, wealthy state with the capacity to mobilize a professional army with astonishing speed. They believed that brutality could overcome strategy, and that infantry, no matter how ferocious, could survive in terrain designed for its annihilation. Before we enter the bloody waters of the Guadalquivir and witness the clash of civilizations that would redefine the defense of Al-Andalus, we invite you to be part of our expedition. If you are passionate about the true stories hidden behind the myths, if you seek to understand the strategy, tactics, and military genius that truly shaped history, be sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Your support is the wind in our sails, allowing us to sail toward forgotten events and bring them to light. Like this video if you're ready to discover how the greatest Viking raid on Muslim lands was transformed into its largest and most humiliating graveyard. To understand the scale of the Viking disaster, we must first understand the nature of the beast into whose lair they had strayed. The Emirate of Cordoba was not a collection of disorganized tribal kingdoms like those the Norse used to terrorize in the north. It was the most sophisticated, wealthy, and centralized state in Western Europe. Its capital, Cordoba, was a dazzling metropolis, a beacon of science, art, and philosophy in an age of darkness. At the head of this power sat Emir Abd al-Rahman II, a man who was no mere warlord, but an accomplished statesman, a poet, and a devoted patron of culture. His reaction to the invasion would not be that of a frightened king, but that of the head of an aggrieved empire, mobilizing the vast resources of a bureaucratic and efficient government. The Emirate's military strength reflected the sophistication of its state. Although later chronicles inflated the numbers to 40,000 men to magnify the glory of victory, the reality was even more impressive. Abd al-Rahman II had no need for hordes. He commanded a professional army of between 15,000 and 20,000 elite soldiers. Unlike the feudal levies of the Christian kingdoms, these were permanent troops, well-paid, rigorously trained, and equipped by the state. Their loyalty was not to a local lord, but directly to the emir in Cordoba. They were a disciplined force, capable of executing complex maneuvers and maintaining cohesion in the heat of battle, something the individualistic Viking warriors rarely faced. The primary and most devastating weapon in the Andalusian arsenal was its cavalry, a force of versatility and lethal power unknown in the EU North. It was composed of two complementary elements working in perfect synchrony. First, the Berber light cavalry, extraordinary riders mounted on swift steeds, acted as the eyes and teeth of the army. They were experts at harassment, throwing javelins and retreating before the enemy could react, wearing down the morale and stamina of the adversary. Then, like thunder on the horizon, emerged the Arab heavy cavalry, the iron fist of the emirate. Armored riders armed with long lances trained to charge in tight formations that impacted with the force of an avalanche. But the army did not rely solely on its cavalry. Its combined arms doctrine made it a formidably balanced force. They had contingents of highly skilled archers, capable of unleashing a volley of arrows that weakened enemy formations before the main charge. Their infantry, composed of loyal Arab and Berber soldiers, as well as slave troops of European origin, formed a solid and resilient core, the anvil upon which the cavalry hammer would crush its opponents. This entire military apparatus was governed by a clear and efficient command hierarchy, with experienced generals like Musa ibn Musa al-Qasi ready to execute strategic orders issued from the capital with precision and speed. The motivation driving this war machine was a powerful and multifaceted force. The brutal sacking of Seville was not merely an act of piracy. It was a deep wound in the religious and cultural heart of Al-Andalus, a desecration that demanded exemplary retribution. Emir Abd al-Rahman II declared a defensive jihad, a sacred calling that united his subjects under a single banner. But beyond faith lay the political imperative. The incursion was a direct challenge to his power and the prestige of the Umayyad Emirate. The response could not be merely defensive. It must be an overwhelming demonstration of force, a lesson etched in blood and fire that would deter any future invader. On the other side of this confrontation stood the invaders, known to Arab chroniclers by a term laden with fear and mystery, the Mayus, the fire worshippers. They did not arrive as a traditional army, with banners and a formal declaration of war. They appeared as a force of nature, a plague risen from the endless ocean. Their ships, with carved dragon prows, were strange and terrifying creatures on the Andalusian shores, their crews an enigma of pagan ferocity. They were the embodiment of chaos, warriors whose way of life was violent raiding and plunder. Their reputation preceded them. They were the Northmen, a people hardened by the cold and the sea, for whom piety was a weakness and fear a tool. This was not a band of desperate pirates, but one of the largest Viking expeditions in history. Estimates speak of a formidable fleet of between 50 and 80 ships, including the fearsome longships and the more agile snekkies. Each ship carried dozens of warriors, placing the total invasion force at between 3,000 and 7,000 men. They were a floating city of veterans thirsty for plunder. Their shallow draft vessels were a marvel of naval engineering, designed not only to sail the seas, but to enter the rivers, taking the war inland to places believed safe from any maritime threat. The Guadalquivir River was not an obstacle for them, but a direct highway to the heart of Andalusian wealth. The men who crewed these vessels were the product of a warlike society, professionals of violence hardened by countless raids along the coasts of France, England, and Ireland. Their lives were a constant preparation for combat. They were experts in hand-to-hand combat, and their arsenal was designed for brutal and efficient carnage. They wielded swords of excellent quality, but their most iconic and feared weapon was the Great Dane axe. With a long handle that required the use of 2 hands, this instrument was capable of shattering a shield, a helmet, and the man carrying it with a single terrifying blow. They were shock infantry, designed to inspire terror and break enemy morale before even breaching their lines. His method of combat was as disciplined as it was savage. The cornerstone of his tactics was the shield wall formation, shield city on the battlefield. Warriors would form a compact phalanx, overlapping their round shields to create a nearly impenetrable barrier. From behind this wall of wood and steel, a hedgehog of spearheads extended. This formation was a mobile bastion, perfect for resisting infantry charges and advancing slowly, crushing everything in its path. It was a simultaneously defensive and offensive tactic, one that had proven invincible against the European armies they had faced. They trusted it blindly, for it was the foundation of all their victories on land. The driving force behind this formidable invasion force was simple, pure, and utterly ruthless: greed. Al-Andalus was a legend in the north, a land of unimaginable riches, of cities with markets brimming with silver, silk, and spices. They didn't come to conquer territory or impose their faith. Their goal was purely economic. They were seeking plunder that would make them kings in their homelands. Their plan was to strike quickly, plunder everything of value, and capture as many prisoners as possible to sell as slaves, one of the most lucrative commodities of the time. They were entrepreneurs of violence, and Seville, the jewel of the Guadalquivir, was the greatest prize they had ever imagined. On this deadly chessboard, each side possessed its own strengths. The Vikings had the ferocity and the element of surprise. The Emirate had the numbers and the knowledge of the terrain. But the real advantage, the secret weapon that would ultimately decide the outcome, was not a piece of military technology or a field tactic. It was something invisible, but infinitely more powerful, the very nature of the Andalusian state. The Vikings based their entire strategy on a fundamental assumption, forged through decades of experience in Europe, that their enemies were slow, disunited, and would take weeks, if not months, to mount a meaningful military response. This assumption had worked perfectly for them against the Christian kingdoms, fragmented by feudal strife, where the king's authority was often weak and his ability to muster an army a long and cumbersome process. What the Mayus couldn't understand was that Al-Andalus operated in a completely different way. The Emirate of Córdoba was not a patchwork of feudal lordships, but a bureaucratic and centralized state, with administrative efficiency rivaling that of ancient Rome. Their hidden weapon was organization. They had a surprisingly rapid communication system, a network of messenger posts that could carry crucial news from the coast to the capital, Córdoba, in a matter of days. As the Vikings began their advance up the Guadalquivir, believing they were operating in darkness, their presence was already known in the emir's palace. They weren't facing an unsuspecting local count, but the intelligence machinery of an empire. This speed of communication allowed for a speed of reaction that proved to be the decisive factor. Upon receiving the news, Abd al-Rahman II did not have to negotiate with reluctant vassals to release troops. As the absolute ruler of a centralized state, he had at his disposal a professional standing army ready to march at his command. He immediately issued mandates to his generals and mobilized the elite units quartered in Córdoba and the garrisons of the border marches. The response was not a levy of peasants, but the coordinated deployment of veteran soldiers, including his formidable cavalry, who set out on the march towards Seville with a speed unthinkable for the Vikings' habitual enemies. This system turned time into the Emirate's main ally and the invaders' mortal enemy. The Viking business model depended on a time lag: attack, plunder, and flee long before Assyrius. Military force could intercept them. They had a long period of impunity to carry out their pillage. The efficiency of the Umayyad administration completely erased that advantage. Suddenly, the clock was ticking against them. Every day they spent sacking Seville and its surroundings was not another day of profit, but one less day of escape. The force coming to meet them wasn't slowly assembling. It was already on its way, closing the distance with each passing hour. Thus, the confrontation emerged not as a simple battle of brute force, but as a collision of two different concepts of warfare and power. On the one hand, a raiding force brilliant in the tactics of the coup de main, but strategically blind to the nature of its opponent. On the other, a state power that, although initially surprised, could absorb the blow and counterattack with a speed and coordinated force that completely nullified the aggressor's initial advantage. The real trap for the Vikings was not waiting on a specific battlefield. The trap was the entire administrative and military system of Al-Andalus, a net that was already closing in on them long before they heard the first gallop of cavalry. The days following the fall of Seville became one long, heady victory celebration for the Vikings. Their camp on the banks of the Guadalquivir was a chaos of wealth and excess. The loot exceeded their wildest dreams. Mountains of silver coins, precious silks, intricate jewelry, and most of all, hundreds of terrified captives. Andalusian wine flowed freely, and the nights were filled with the sound of war songs and boasts. In their minds, the campaign had been a resounding success. They had stormed one of the greatest cities they had ever seen, massacred its defenders with ease, and now they rested, enjoying the fruits of their brutality. This sense of triumph bred a dangerous overconfidence, an arrogance that blinded them to the storm methodically brewing in the distance. As the Mayus reveled in their plunder, a silent shadow spread across the landscape. The Emirates' army, mobilized at a speed inconceivable to the invaders, was already close. They advanced not with the thunder of a barbarian army, but with the silent, lethal discipline of a professional force. They were thousands of cavalry and infantry moving as a single organism, guided by cold anger and an unwavering purpose: to avenge Seville and annihilate the desecrators. Their scouts, agile and stealthy Berber horsemen, watched the Viking camp from the hills, counting ships, estimating numbers, and studying the routines of the unsuspecting Norsemen. Every piece of information was sent back to the main body of the army, which waited patiently for the perfect time and place to exact its revenge. The stage for the final confrontation had already been chosen by the emir's generals. It was the Tablada Plains, a vast expanse of flat, open terrain on the outskirts of Seville. For the Vikings, this field was nothing more than the space they must cross to return to their ships. For the Andalusian cavalry, it was an ideal slaughterhouse, a place without hills, forests, or obstacles in which to hide. Terrain where a static infantry formation, like the shield wall, would be completely exposed, vulnerable to charges from all sides. The atmosphere was charged with an invisible tension. On one side, the noisy arrogance of a predator who believes himself secure. On the other, the quiet, patient determination of a hunter who has already closed all escape routes. The calm was about to be broken. It all began in late summer 844. The massive Viking fleet was first sighted on the Atlantic coasts of the Iberian Peninsula, testing the defenses of the Christian kingdoms to the north. In Galicia and Asturias, they encountered stubborn resistance, a harsh land, and people accustomed to fighting for their survival. After several clashes without a decisive victory, the Mayas turned south, sailing along the coast of what is now Portugal, in search of an easier and more lucrative target. It was then that they discovered the estuary of a great river, a wide and tempting waterway that led deep into the heart of the land, the Guadalquivir. For them, accustomed to using rivers as highways for their raids, this was an irresistible invitation, the gateway to the legendary and, they believed, gentle lands of Al-Andalus. The Norse fleet's advance up the river was a strike of terrifying audacity and speed. The local defenses, designed to repel land attacks or small-scale sea raids, proved completely useless. The small watchtowers and garrisons that dotted the riverbanks were overwhelmed, their defenders massacred before they could effectively raise the alarm. Panic spread like a plague throughout the region. Tales that ran ahead of the invaders spoke of blonde giants, demonically ferocious, who showed no mercy and killed for the pleasure of it. For the peaceful farmers and inhabitants of the small riverside villages, the appearance of dragon prows on the horizon was the harbinger of the end of the world, an apocalyptic vision come true. On September 25, 844, the Viking horde reached the gates of Ishbilia, Muslim Seville. Although it was an important commercial and cultural center, the city was unprepared for an invasion of this magnitude. Its defenses were relics of more peaceful times, its walls ancient, and its garrison insufficient. The civilians watched in horror as the river filled with the enemy fleet, a forest of masts and monstrous prows that vomited thousands of warriors onto its banks. The assault was not a prolonged technical siege, but a furious and direct onslaught. The Mayas hurled themselves against the walls with overwhelming ferocity, using ladders and their own brute strength to overcome the defenses. The resistance, though valiant, was quickly drowned in blood, and the city gates gave way to the invaders' unstoppable push. Once inside, Seville became the Norsemen's personal hell. The fighting in the city's narrow streets was a disorganized slaughter where the Viking superiority in hand-to-hand combat proved devastating. The few garrison soldiers and citizens who took up arms were mercilessly slaughtered. For 7 days, the city was subjected to a systematically brutal plunder. The mosques, with their silver lamps and rich ornaments, were among the first targets, desecrated and stripped of all value. The markets and the homes of wealthy merchants were emptied, their wealth accumulated over generations, becoming a heap of loot to be transported to the cold northern lands. The air was filled with the smoke of the fires and the screams of the dying. The human cost of the plunder was horrific. The Vikings made no distinction between soldiers and civilians. Men, women, and children were slaughtered in the streets, in their homes, in their places of worship. The violence was indiscriminate, an instrument of terror designed to completely break the city spirit. But death was not the only fate. Hundreds of civilians, mainly young women and strong men, were captured, chained, and dragged onto ships. Their value as slaves in European markets was immense, and they constituted a vital part of the loot. For the Vikings, they were simply another form of merchandise, human livestock whose suffering was irrelevant compared to the profit they would generate. Yet, at the height of their savage triumph, the Vikings were committing their gravest strategic error. Intoxicated by the ease of conquest and the immensity of the loot, they remained in the Seville area too long. Their initial success had instilled in them a sense of invincibility, leading them to fatally underestimate the responsiveness of their victims. Every day they spent looting, celebrating, and organizing their treasury was a day they conceded to the Emir of Córdoba. News of the atrocity in Seville had not fallen on deaf ears. While the Vikings counted their coins, Abd al-Rahman II counted his soldiers. The orgy of destruction in Seville had sealed the fate of the invaders, transforming a pirate raid into a matter of honor and revenge for the entire emirate. As Seville burned, news of the catastrophe traveled at astonishing speed toward the heart of Andalusian power. Relief riders galloped tirelessly along the Roman roads that still connected the empire, carrying the message of the invasion and plunder directly to the capital, Córdoba. When the report reached the palace of Emir Abd al-Rahman II, the court was plunged into a mixture of shock and outrage. This was no simple border raid or act of piracy. It was a violation at the heart of Al-Andalus, an attack on one of its most treasured cities. The Emir, a man known as much for his love of culture as for his political astuteness, immediately grasped the magnitude of the threat. This wasn't just an attack on his people, it was a direct challenge to his throne. Abd al-Rahman II's response was immediate, resolute, and ruthless. There was no hesitation or debate about whether to pay a ransom or negotiate. The honor of the emirate and the security of its people demanded a crushing retaliation. From his throne in Córdoba, he orchestrated the defense with the precision of a master. His first act was to declare a defensive jihad, a call to arms that resonated throughout every mosque in Al-Andalus. This was not just a political move to unite his subjects. It was a profound expression of the conviction that they were defending their faith and their civilization against a horde of pagan barbarians. War became a sacred obligation, ensuring that he would have the full support of his people and his soldiers. Immediately after the call to jihad, the emirate's formidable military machine was set in motion. Urgent orders were sent to the commanders of the elite troops quartered in the capital. At the same time, messengers were dispatched to the border marches, ordering the governors to mobilize their garrisons and send them south. The plan was simple and lethal. Converge on the Seville area from multiple directions, trapping the Vikings in a steel pincer. Unlike a feudal king who had to plead with his nobles, the emir commanded. His centralized authority allowed him to mobilize a combined army of infantry, archers, and, crucially, thousands of cavalry in record time. Thus, while the Mayas continued their orgy of pillage, completely oblivious to the danger looming over them, a disciplined and highly motivated army was already on its way. With each passing day, this force grew in number and drew closer to its prey. The emir's response was not simply reactive, it was strategic. He sought not just to expel the invaders, but to annihilate them. He wanted to teach a lesson that would be heard in the farthest northern fjords. The speed and scale of this mobilization were the embodiment of the emirate's hidden advantage. The Vikings had judged their enemy by the weakness of Seville's defenses, not realizing that they had only kicked in the door of a lion's den. The unprecedented success and the staggering amount of loot they had accumulated had a narcotic effect on the Viking invaders. They grew careless, consumed by greed and arrogance. Instead of making a swift and safe retreat with their gains, they lingered in the region, establishing a base camp from which they launched smaller raids on nearby towns like Coria del Rio and Constantina. They believed that Al-Andalus lay at their feet, that their fighting spirit had been annihilated in Seville. They spent their days dividing the loot, feasting, and planning future glories, blind to the web spun around them. Their discipline, the very discipline that made them so formidable in battle, began to erode under the weight of gold and complacency. Every moment of inaction was another nail in their own coffin. It was then that they began to feel the first signs that they were not alone. Plundering parties that ventured far from the main camp began to suffer hit-and-run attacks. These were not direct engagements, but guerrilla tactics executed with deadly skill. Groups of Berber horsemen, moving with the speed of the wind, would emerge from nowhere, unleash a volley of javelins upon the surprised Norsemen, and disappear before the heavy Viking infantry could even form their shield wall. These attacks were the work of the vanguard of the Emir's army, designed to harass, demoralize, and gather intelligence. However, the Vikings, in their hubris, probably interpreted them as mere nuisances, the last pathetic spasms of a crushed local resistance, rather than what they truly were, the prelude to their annihilation. On November 11th, 844, the patience of the Emir's generals paid off. Fed up with the harassment and blinded by arrogance, the Viking leaders finally decided to leave their camp to crush the forces harassing them. The Andalusians presented them with the perfect bait. A seemingly small contingent of troops positioned themselves conspicuously on the plains of Tablada. For the Vikings, this was the pitched battle they had longed for, an opportunity to form their legendary shield wall and once and for all sweep away what they considered an insignificant local militia. They saw a direct challenge, and without hesitation, mobilized the bulk of their army to accept it, abandoning the relative safety of their riverside defenses. The sight of the Viking army marching toward the plain must have been formidable. Several thousand warriors in full battle formation, their shields painted, their steel helmets gleaming in the sun, and a forest of axes and spears upon their heads. They advanced with the confident gait of an army that had never known defeat in the open field, expecting an easy and glorious victory before returning to their treasure-laden ships. Every step they took them further away from the river, their only escape route, and deeper into the center of the meticulously prepared trap. They were willingly marching toward their own extermination, completely unaware of the true scale of the force that awaited them. When the Vikings were already in the heart of the plain, far from any refuge, the trap closed. The Andalusian force in front of them began a feigned retreat, a classic move to incite pursuit and throw the enemy ranks into disarray. As the Norsemen advanced, shouting cheers of victory, the unthinkable happened. Suddenly, from the depressions, in the terrain, and from behind the low hills that flanked the plain, thousands of horsemen emerged. The horizon was filled with banners and the gleam of spears. The small force they had come to crush was only the tip of a spear in a massive army that now completely surrounded them. Stupor must have frozen the blood in the Vikings' veins. The open battlefield had been transformed into a deadly cage. At that instant, the stark reality of their tactical situation hit them like a hammer. They were trapped. They were a slow, heavy infantry force in the middle of a plain perfect for cavalry. Their only escape route, the way back to their ships, was cut off. Their most reliable formation, the shield wall, was designed to withstand a frontal attack, but was horribly vulnerable to being flanked and attacked from the rear. Abd al-Rahman Seku's generals had achieved the ideal tactical situation. They had dictated the when and where of the battle, choosing terrain that completely nullified the enemy's strengths and maximized their own. The game was over before the first blow was struck. The hunt was about to begin. The battle began without the clash of swords, but with a hissing sound that turned into a roar. On the orders of their generals, the mounted archers of the Andalusian army advanced. Light and swift, they began to gallop in circles around the Viking formation, staying out of range of their missiles. From their saddles, they unleashed a calculated and lethal storm of arrows. It wasn't a single volley, but a constant and methodical harassment. The arrows rained down on the shield wall, seeking any gap in the formation, wounding men in the legs and arms, and forcing the Norsemen to duck their heads and focus solely on surviving this ranged assault. The great Viking fortress had become a static and perfect target. Under the relentless barrage of arrows, the shield wall's cohesion began to waver. Men fell, gaps opened, and panic began to spread. This was the moment the heavy cavalry had been waiting for. At the sound of battle horns, thousands of Arab horsemen, the elite of the Emir's army, began their advance. First at a trot, then at a gallop, the charge became a thunderclap that shook the earth. It was a vision of organized military power, a mass of iron and muscle advancing in perfect formation, their long cavalry lances lowered and aimed straight for the heart of the weakening Norse line. For the trapped Vikings, it was the end of the world galloping. Toward them, the impact was cataclysmic. The wave of war horses crashed into the shield wall with overwhelming kinetic force. The formation, designed to halt the onslaught of men on foot, simply could not withstand the weight and speed of the heavy cavalry. Wooden shields split like cordwood, the Vikings' spears shattered, and the first line of defenders was literally crushed, rolled over, and trampled by the horses. The Andalusian horsemen's lances, longer and wielded with the force of the charge, pierced shields and chainmail alike, opening bloody gaps in the formation. The legendary and impregnable shield city disintegrated in an instant. Once the line broke, it was all over. The cavalry charge didn't stop. It ripped through the Viking formation, breaking it up into small, isolated, terrified groups. Discipline and cohesion, the Norsemen's greatest advantages, evaporated in an instant. Now they were no longer an army, but a mob of individuals desperately fighting for their lives. The Andalusian horsemen, having passed through them, wheeled around and began charging into the backs of the scattered groups, while fresh waves of cavalry and infantry poured into the remnants. The battle had transformed into a one-sided massacre. The Vikings were completely outmatched, surrounded, and being hunted down on the very field they had chosen for their glorious victory. With the complete breakdown of their formation, the legendary courage of the Viking warriors evaporated, replaced by absolute panic. Order vanished, and the army decomposed into a mob of terrified men. The instinct for survival drowned out any thought of organized fighting. The battle, as a confrontation between two armies, was over. What followed was a full-scale manhunt. The Norsemen's war cries were replaced by shrieks of terror as they tried to escape an enemy that seemed to be everywhere at once. Their reputation as relentless predators shattered in a matter of minutes, revealing the fragility behind their ferocity when their combat system collapsed. The Tableta countryside was transformed into a slaughterhouse. The Andalusian cavalry, now unopposed, moved with lethal freedom, pursuing and annihilating the scattered groups of Vikings. There was no escape possible on the open plain. Every fleeing Norseman was an easy target for the swift Berber horsemen and the heavy spears of the Arabs. The Emirates' infantry advanced methodically across the countryside, finishing off the wounded and wiping out the small pockets of resistance that tried to form. It was a cold, systematic, and overwhelming revenge, retribution for every life taken and every home burned in Seville. The earth of the plain was soaked with the blood of the invaders. A few survivors, the fastest or the luckiest, managed to escape the epicenter of the carnage and began a desperate race toward the only salvation they could imagine. Their ships anchored in the Guadalquivir. It was a chaotic and agonizing flight across several kilometers of hostile terrain. They threw away their heavy axes, their shields, and anything else that might slow them down. Panic gave them strength, but the distance was enormous and their pursuers tireless. Every shadow seemed like a rider, every sound the approaching gallop of death. The image of their longships, once symbols of their power, had become a distant and unattainable mirage of safety. But their escape was doomed. The Emirates' light cavalry, perfectly adapted for the pursuit, descended upon the fugitives. It was a relentless hunt that extended from the battlefield to the very banks of the river. The riders caught up with the exhausted Vikings with ease, bringing them down one by one. The path to the ships became a trail of corpses. Of the thousands of warriors who had marched arrogantly toward Tableta that morning, only a tiny handful would make it to the safety of their ships. The vast majority met their end on the plain or in the race for the river, hunted, like animals by an army that knew no mercy. The climax of the massacre took place on the banks of the Guadalquivir. The few Vikings who reached the river found themselves in a scene of absolute chaos. As they desperately tried to raise anchors and push their ships into the current, the Andalusian forces arrived on the shore, raining arrows and javelins down on them. Some ships, those ready to sail, managed to sail away, but many others were stranded or boarded by the emir's soldiers. The collapse was total. The Viking leaders who survived, if they did, could only watch helplessly as a significant portion of their mighty fleet was captured or burned. The fire consuming the dragon prows on the very bank they had conquered was the ultimate symbol of their humiliating and utter defeat. As night fell and the last shouts fell silent, the scale of the Andalusian victory became apparent on the battlefield. The casualty count was horribly disproportionate. Chronicles estimate that between 1,000 and 2,000 Viking warriors lay dead on the plains of Tableta and along the road to the river. Considering the overall size of their force, this represented a catastrophic loss, the annihilation of a substantial part of their expeditionary army. By contrast, casualties on the Emirates' side were remarkably lower, a testament to the brilliance of their plan and the flawless execution of their tactics. It had not been a battle of attrition, but a masterpiece of military strategy, where cavalry and archers had dismantled the enemy with clinical efficiency. The fate of those who did not die in battle was, in many ways, worse. Some 400 Vikings were taken prisoner. They were not accorded honorable treatment as prisoners of war. For Abd al-Rahman II, they were merely criminals and desecrators, and their punishment was meant to serve as an unforgettable warning. They were taken back to a liberated but ruined Seville, and in an act of poetic and brutal justice, they were hanged from the trunks of the palm trees that lined the Guadalquivir. The image of the bodies of the feared Northmen swaying in the breeze served as a powerful and macabre message to the local population and any future invaders. This is how Al-Andalus treats its enemies. In addition to human lives, the emir's forces recovered a large portion of the treasure that had been stolen from Seville, returning some of its plundered wealth to the city. But the capture and burning of approximately 30 Viking ships was perhaps the most significant strategic blow. A Viking fleet was an immense investment of resources and manpower, and losing so many ships in a single campaign was a financial and military disaster. The leaders who managed to escape did so with a decimated fleet, a skeleton crew, and the bitter taste of humiliation. They returned north, not with tales of glory, but with a dire warning of an empire to the south that was as rich and sophisticated as it was lethally dangerous. The repercussions of the Battle of Tablada extended far beyond the bloodied field. News of the annihilation of the great Viking fleet resonated throughout the known world. Abd al-Rahman II's prestige soared. In the Islamic world, he was hailed as a champion of the faith, the defender of Al-Andalus. In the Christian courts of Europe, where the Vikings were a seemingly unstoppable plague, the news was greeted with a mixture of awe and grudging respect. The emir of Córdoba had achieved what northern kings and emperors had failed to do, not only repel but exterminate a Norse invasion force. This victory immensely consolidated his power at home and projected an image of strength and unwavering resolve abroad. However, the most lasting and significant impact was strategic in nature. The raid had been a brutally effective wake-up call, exposing a critical vulnerability in the Emirates' defense, its defenselessness against attacks from the sea. Abd al-Rahman II, being a pragmatic statesman, learned his lesson. Immediately after the victory, he initiated an ambitious and expensive program of coastal defense and naval rearmament. He ordered the construction of Atarazana's large naval shipyards in Seville, turning the very city that had been the victim of the attack into the heart of the new maritime power of Al-Andalus. He fortified the coast and established a permanent surveillance system to prevent future surprises. This decision forever transformed Andalusian military doctrine. Before the incursion, Al-Andalus was a predominantly land-based power, centered on its borders with the Christian kingdoms to the north. After 844, the powerful Umayyad navy was born. This new fleet not only patrolled the coast, but became a tool for power projection. In the decades and century that followed, it would dominate the Strait of Gibraltar and the Western Mediterranean, protecting trade routes, launching its own raids, and ensuring that no enemy fleet could threaten the Andalusian coast with impunity. Paradoxically, the brutal Viking attack was the catalyst that forced the emirate to become the region's naval superpower. Over time, the victory at Tablada became woven into the tapestry of the founding history of the Emirate of Córdoba. Arab chroniclers narrated it as an epic, a shining example of how faith, organization, and decisive leadership could triumph over barbarism and chaos. It became a cautionary tale about hubris and its punishment, and a source of national pride. Abd al-Rahman II went down in history not only as a patron of the arts and sciences, but as the savior of his people, the wise ruler who faced the demons from the north and vanquished them. The battle became a pillar of his legacy, an enduring symbol of the resilience and power of the Andalusian state. Thus, the Great Mayas raid on Al-Andalus, which began with fire and fury with the intention of plundering an empire, ended in near total annihilation, and the birth of a new era of naval power for the Emirate of Córdoba. The story became legend, a testament to the fact that organization and strategy can defeat the most blind ferocity. It proved that underestimating an adversary is the most fatal mistake a commander can make. Yet amidst this epic of blood and steel, there is an epilogue so strange and so human that it defies the logic of the saga. A final twist of fate for a handful of survivors reveals the unpredictable nature of history itself. Of the hundreds of captured prisoners, not all were executed. A small number were offered a choice, hanging or conversion to Islam. These few, facing certain death, renounced Odin and Thor and embraced the faith of their conquerors. But their story doesn't end there. Chronicles record that these converts were allowed to live and settled as farmers in the fertile region near Seville in the Correa del Rio area. And these last vestiges of Viking fury, the once terrifying fire worshippers, became famous in the area for an unusual activity. They became excellent cheesemakers, selling their products in the very markets they once tried to destroy. An incredibly mundane and peaceful end to one of the most brutal raids in history. The irony of this ultimate fate for the survivors is profound. For a Viking warrior, whose identity and social status were intrinsically linked to his skill in combat and reputation for ferocity, a life as a peaceful farmer on the lands of his enemies was a form of living death. Abd al-Rahman II, by sparing their lives in exchange for their conversion and assimilation, achieved a more subtle and perhaps more complete victory than that of his generals on the battlefield. He not only destroyed their bodies, but dismantled their very essence as warriors, replacing the axe with the plow and the war cry with the silence of the pastures. It was the ultimate annihilation, not only of an army, but of an ideology. The echoes of this catastrophic defeat undoubtedly traveled back to the cold northern fjords. Although it did not halt the Viking Age, the story of Tablada would have been told in mead halls, not as a saga of glory, but as a dark warning. Al-Andalus gained a formidable reputation, not as an unprotected treasure chest, but as a snake pit heavily defended by an organized and lethal power. This terrible defeat likely deterred other great fleets from attempting the same route, pushing Viking ambitions toward more familiar and less dangerous targets such as the coasts of France and England, thus altering the course of raiding for decades to come. For generations, the fields of Tablada remained a silent reminder of the massacre. The bones of the invaders mingled with the Andalusian soil, fertilizing the very fields they had sought to conquer. The site became an unofficial monument to the Emirates' victory, a landscape imbued with the memory of a clash of civilizations. It represented the triumph of a centralized state, with its bureaucracy, communications, and professional army, over an older model of warfare based on individual ferocity and the tactics of the coup de main. On those plains, strategic sophistication proved to be an infinitely more powerful weapon than brute force. In the end, the story of the Viking raid on Seville forces us to question the myths. The opening question, how did 800 Vikings destroy 40,000 Saracens, echoes how we prefer history to be, a simple tale of heroes versus hordes. The truth, however, is often more complex and far more instructive. It shows us that hubris is the downfall of the powerful, that organization is the secret weapon of the civilized, and that real history is not always found in the clash of swords, but sometimes in the unexpected destiny of a warrior who trades his axe for the art of cheese-making.